Welcome to Draw 4, where I draw 4 topics with the best Flesh and Blood players. Today, my guest is Lucas Oswald. He knows Yu-Gi-Oh! And Flesh and Blood from a pro player's perspective. Lucas was the North American Dragon Duel Champion in 2019, but nowadays you see him battle his way through the World Championship in Flesh and Blood. Lucas, welcome to the show.
Hi, happy to be here. Super stoked to talk about Yu-Gi-Oh!
Yeah, man, we are just recording this right before Christmas, but the episode will actually come out after Christmas. But for me, I have to say, this is a Christmas present to me that we can talk about this topic. So I have a few questions to start with, but before we jump into those, actually, let's give the viewers a little bit of a roundup on your backstory. I already said it in the intro. You were the North American Dragon Duel Champion in 2019. How old were you back then and how old are you now?
I was 13 when I won the Dragon Duel North American Championship and then went to Worlds for Yu-Gi-Oh! I'm 17 now. The past 4 years have been a lot of fun for card games. Just getting better and better, playing a better game in my opinion now. But yeah.
So then, what was the last big Flesh and Blood tournament for you?
The last big Flesh and Blood tournament I played in was the Realm 20K in Columbus. I played Prism. I didn't do super well in the 20K. I went 4-3, but then I went 5-3 in the 10K. Got a little bit of cash, and then top 4 the Team Sealed event as well. And then before that, the big one was the first Living Legend Battle Hardened in Barcelona, where I went undefeated in Swiss and ended up taking it down, going 12-0, playing Starvo. Yeah, that was the last big thing I did.
Yeah, I was there too at the World Championship, but I didn't see how you won in the end because it was a pretty long tournament.
Yeah, there were 4 people in the venue that didn't work there at the end. It was just me, Charles, and 2 guys from LSS. So, yeah.
Like you said, that was a really important tournament in the Flesh and Blood history. So I think it's an honor to be the champion of that one, right?
Oh yeah, no, like absolutely, like a historic tournament. The first Living Legend tournament with the first Prism statue and the Marvel, and being at Worlds and being so many players, and probably getting to register 3 Oakenolds for like the last time ever. That's pretty sweet.
It is, man. It is super interesting to watch from outside, but I can only assume how it is experienced at the finals. So we want to compare Flesh and Blood and Yu-Gi-Oh! Today. We want to dive into also a little bit of a deeper conversation about it, because I think you can really tell from a different perspective, because you won big tournaments in Yu-Gi-Oh! But now you are competing on a big level in Flesh and Blood. And you made your decision coming from Yu-Gi-Oh! But now focusing yourself on Flesh and Blood. So let's give those viewers who have no clue about what is possible in Flesh and Blood actually a kind of a view on what is possible. And I want to, bring the question on, how much did you actually earn this year? Can you give us like a rough estimation?
Yeah, so for Flesh and Blood this year, I traveled to a lot of events, so it was pretty expensive to be able to make it to all these events. But what I'll say is, if we're just talking about like money that I walked away with weekend of Flesh and Blood tournaments between, gold foils and cash from Legendary Studios, I am very much in the plus. It was actually a very, very good year for me. Obviously, I did pretty well, and to do pretty well, you have to get quite lucky. But I could have done a lot worse and still made quite a bit of money compared to a game like Yu-Gi-Oh! Where really, unless you win like a large tournament, it's really hard to make your money back because there's no cash. The only prizes are prize cards and sometimes packs. But you look at something like the regional circuit with Yu-Gi-Oh! And, first place will get a mat and a deck box for your $20 entry. And then you look at something like Flesh and Blood, where first place at a Battle Hardened, even if it's significantly fewer players, you'll get, $500, PTI that can be worth anywhere from, $500 to $1,000, depending on the season, as well as a gold foil that, you can sell for multiple thousands of dollars. And you can do that from winning a, 90-player Battle Hardened. And then at Yu-Gi-Oh! You make, maybe $150 off of your 900-player regional win. So one thing about Flesh and Blood, like pricing wise, is that it is much better, not only for winning Flesh and Blood Worlds is just completely different story than winning something like Yu-Gi-Oh! Worlds.
Yeah.
But then you also have, just doing reasonably well, top hitting a Battle Hardened or top 32ing a Calling gives you a lot more than some of these Yu-Gi-Oh! Events, especially when you consider how many players are in the actual tournaments. With Yu-Gi-Oh! Having a lot higher tournament representation, it's harder to do better at these events, and even if you do better, it's still not as good pricing as something like Flesh and Blood.
Yeah. So I wanted to bring up the pricing question because this is a key question that pro players need to ask themselves, I think, when they are deciding on which game they want to play seriously. We are not talking from a casual perspective here, and for sure there are other reasons that we want to bring up that are also very important, but for a player like your stake, traveling around the world for this game, the money is pretty important.
Yeah, absolutely.
So now let's come to the main topics. We have 4 of those, and the first one actually I want to talk about your origin in Yu-Gi-Oh! How did it all start out?
Yeah, so I actually started off Yu-Gi-Oh! By watching the TV show with my brother while I was around 9 years old. I started going to my local game store when I was 9. And then I played Yu-Gi-Oh! For about 5 years. Obviously, when I was 13, I won the Dragon Duel North American World Championship qualifier. And then I got to go to Berlin for the World Championship. Didn't do so well there, unfortunately. But then right after that, COVID hit pretty soon. And then I actually did pretty well in some online tournaments for Yu-Gi-Oh! I think that's kind of when I peaked. It was in COVID, like 2020, 2021, starting to really come into my own. But there were no tournaments. So I couldn't really prove it and go out and be the pro that I'd always wanted to be in Yu-Gi-Oh! I was kind of at that point where I had leveled up, but I couldn't really show it and go out and play. And then I started playing Flesh and Blood around that time just for fun. I work at a local game store, so we had just started selling Flesh and Blood. We had been selling Yu-Gi-Oh! For a while. And I was like, hey, this game looks fun. I'm looking for something new. Just maybe play it with my friends. And then I started playing it, and I absolutely loved it. I had played a few other games before in the past, but really I had always kind of come back to Yu-Gi-Oh! But Flesh and Blood felt different for me. I really loved playing it, and I also really loved that there were actually tournaments I could go to. The first time I actually played Classic Constructed at a real capacity was at a Calling in Orlando, that I traveled to. I just played this Katsu deck that I found online. I changed a few cards. I was like, this is pretty sweet. The Briar deck had just kind of come and people kind of knew what was happening, and I was terrified of it. But I was like, it's probably fine. And then I actually ended up going 8-3, and I got 24th place. And that was kind of when I was like, okay, maybe I can actually do something in this game. If I could take such a bad deck, beat all these good decks, and do well, maybe I can travel around like I'd always wanted to for Yu-Gi-Oh! But for Yu-Gi-Oh! It wasn't reasonable. The pricing wasn't that good, and I didn't feel like I had access to tournaments at that time. And I was like, you know what? Let's just go all in on Flesh and Blood, and then here we are now.
Yeah, it's interesting to see because I was in Yu-Gi-Oh! Before Flesh and Blood 2, and now our ways are crossing here. And we kind of, I think, can relate to a few things that are important in this comparison, both on the positive and on the negative side. And that is why I want to ask you, why do you actually like Yu-Gi-Oh? What is it that you like about the game?
Yeah, Yu-Gi-Oh! I think is one of the more unique spaces in card games. Obviously, since I work at a local game store, so I've played and experienced and sold and held tournaments for so many different games. And one thing that's consistently unique about Yu-Gi-Oh! Is your ability to express yourself and be creative. The card pool is so huge. It's not a rotating game. So many different cards and archetypes are playable that really you can get your creative juices going and just play anything you want in Yu-Gi-Oh!, which is really unique. It's also one of the higher power games. You get to do big explosive things, especially with your extra deck having this, kind of consistency piece that you have access to every game, but you can still be creative with, and, your opponent never knows what's coming, and there's a lot of interaction. There's a lot going on. So I think Yu-Gi-Oh! Is one of the more exciting games to play, especially at the casual level. I love playing casual Yu-Gi-Oh! Just picking up a deck that my friends hand me, and they're like, well, this does this, this, and this. And I'm like, I'll figure it out. And then you just sit down and you do these really powerful, explosive things. And, you get to tell your opponent not to do any of their powerful, explosive things. It's a lot of fun. And then it also has this cool grindy aspect where, like other games, you can get into slow games and you set your trap cards and you play around certain things. So I do love Yu-Gi-Oh, even though I don't play it anymore. I think it's a really good game. But yeah, no, I love it.
Is there a favorite card that you still have in Yu-Gi-Oh?
There is. Yeah, my favorite Yu-Gi-Oh card is Fantastical Dragon Phantasme. It's it's a card that came out in 2019, I believe. But it's got some space in my heart from some personal stories, but also the card's just awesome. Like cool art, awesome effect. But yeah, I love Phantasme.
We touched on the Dragon Duel side of things in Yu-Gi-Oh already, but I'm pretty sure that not all viewers, especially those who are coming from Flesh and Blood, know what the Dragon Duel is. Can you explain to those?
Yeah, so Dragon Duel is basically, when I played it was for 13 and under players. It's a junior division. I think now it's 14 and under is the age range, but really it's younger players. Typically in North America at the World Championship qualifier, you see somewhere from 60 to 90 players roughly, I believe, playing in the World Championship qualifier. So it's a pretty small event, but yeah, it's where kids can come and play. And that was where I played all of the nationals, or the North American World Championship qualifiers that I played. I played in the Dragon Duels, and then kind of once I aged out of that and started playing with the adults, I had always played like regionals and locals with adults, but getting to play, especially online with older players and more experienced players, kind of leveled me up. But yeah, I mean, I'll always love Dragon Duels.
So that is something that we don't have in Flesh and Blood. It's interesting.
Yeah, but, yeah, I mean, when the game is 16 plus suggestion on the box, it kind of makes sense to not have a junior division.
Yeah. We have some guests that are joining.
We do have some guests, yeah. Yeah, this one right here is one of the main characters of the Runaways podcast, which we'll get to later. He's been on every episode.
Yes. So happy to see them too. So the Dragon Duel is kind of like you talked about it. It was a peak for you in Yu-Gi-Oh! You were also going to the World Championship in Berlin. But tell us more about it. Like, how was it for you at such a young age to win this massive duel and then also to fly around the world for Yu-Gi-Oh?
Yeah, it was really cool. I had always kind of had the goal of winning that tournament. From when I first went to the first North American World Championship qualifier that I went to, I believe it was in Chicago. I think the first year actually might have been in Pittsburgh. The year I won was definitely in Pittsburgh. And there was at least one other year that was Pittsburgh. But I mean, from the first year, I played in, I believe, 4 of these tournaments, maybe 3. And the first year, I didn't do well. And then the next year, I lost in top 32. And then the next year, I lost in top 8. And then the next year was my last year. I was about to age out. So I was like, well, gotta lock in, gotta win. And it was a top 32 cut. I snuck in at like 29th or something. And then we just kept on winning. But it was really sweet. Like I said, it was my goal in the game for a while. It was like the ultimate thing that I wanted to do was win that tournament. I had a bunch of friends who had won that tournament and gone on to Worlds as well. So being able to join them was really sweet. And then being able to go to Berlin was also amazing. The experience was so much fun. I got to meet so many people and talk to so many people. Some of my good friends to this day I met at that tournament. Unfortunately, the tournament didn't go super well for me. There's a whole host of stories about that, but I got 10th in a 12-person tournament, so that didn't go super well. But it was so much fun. I mean, I got like so many friends, so many new experiences. Getting to walk around Berlin was awesome. Berlin was a really cool city. I'd love to go back there sometime for Flesh and Blood.
All right. You already said a few things about you then deciding to come to the other side, to Flesh and Blood. And actually not pursuing your career alongside Yu-Gi-Oh! As a pro player. Let's talk about that on our second big topic, as the tide turned for you. When did you really decide to quit Yu-Gi-Oh! From a pro player's perspective? Like, what was it that made you quit?
So my, I guess, quitting from Yu-Gi-Oh! Was more of a slow decline. I never really had a day where I woke up and I decided I'm not playing Yu-Gi-Oh! Anymore. But it was kind of a slow thing. I mean, the first thing really was I started to take Flesh and Blood seriously. My goal in card games and in Yu-Gi-Oh! Specifically had always been to be one of the best, to travel around, to play a whole lot, to be a pro. And so in Flesh and Blood, I saw an opportunity to do that. And I knew I had what it takes. And I knew that with the prizing and with how many events there were, I really had the opportunity to do it. But then in Yu-Gi-Oh, it kind of just slowed down where I started playing Flesh and Blood more. If there was an opportunity to play both, I'd play Flesh and Blood. I would go to fewer and fewer Yu-Gi-Oh locals. I wouldn't invest in cards, things like that. But the reasons that I left Yu-Gi-Oh there's a few of them. The first one is the secondary market for Yu-Gi-Oh I really don't like from a player's perspective. Cards getting reprinted constantly and being such a fast-moving meta means that your investments often don't pay off. You look at the most recent Yu-Gi-Oh set, or not the most recent, but one of the more recent sets of the Rarity Collection. That set basically just destroyed any value that the game had. The game went from having a lot of cards worth, $20, $30 that were originally like $100, and now they're worth actually $2, $3 because of that set, or in some cases even less, like $1. So investing in Yu-Gi-Oh was really not worth it. And then combined with the pricing being so poor, playing Yu-Gi-Oh is not just a hobby, it's not an investment, it's something that you have to pay for, basically. You have to put your money in and you don't get a whole lot back most of the time, unless you're constantly selling and being on top of it every day and make it your job, basically. Whereas Flesh and Blood, your investments are a lot more secure. We see even cards that have been reprinted 3 times, like Tunic, still hold a reasonable amount of value, right? Welcome to Wraith Tunics, I believe, are still around $150, which even though they were a lot more in the past, they're still worth something, which I can't say for something like Pot of Prosperity, which in Yu-Gi-Oh is $120, and now I have copies in my store for like $3. And another reason was I just liked Flesh and Blood more, which I guess I can kind of get into the different reasons for that. But Flesh and Blood, Yu-Gi-Oh was always a game where deck building was really important. But as much as I love deck building in Yu-Gi-Oh, I really liked having variation in my games and the ability to kind of adapt and play better at the table, which felt like it was lacking a little bit in Yu-Gi-Oh. Player skill is incredibly important in Yu-Gi-Oh. I think a lot more important than people that don't play the game realize. But a lot of it comes down to reps and just getting your matchups down. If you play 100 games with the same matchup in Yu-Gi-Oh, a lot of those games will be quite similar or potentially even almost the same, as well as having a lot of non-games. Whereas in Flesh and Blood, since you see 4 different cards every turn, even the fastest of matchups last 3 to 4 turns, you always are seeing different combinations of cards, having interesting decisions, and there's always different variation in games, which really allows you to flex your muscles as a better player or somebody who's more experienced in a matchup. So I think ultimately for me, it was the variation in games that makes me like Flesh and Blood more. Also just the length of the games. I like Yu-Gi-Oh! People always joke that, especially if they don't play it, it's like a one-turn game or whatever. It's not really a one-turn game, but a lot of the decisions are made in the first turn or two, and then sometimes it is a one-turn game. Whereas Flesh and Blood, really, like every game, even the fastest of games, there's eventually a grind. They're both players are out 1, and you're trying to figure out how you're going to get able to take all your opponent's cards and kill them ultimately. So there's always interesting decisions in Flesh and Blood, even in the most boring of games. Whereas I think in Yu-Gi-Oh, that's just not true. I think I could play games of Yu-Gi-Oh perfectly. Not easily, but I think it's something you can do. Whereas in Flesh and Blood, I always talk about this with somebody who was on the show recently, Brody Spurlock. We always talk about how we don't really think people play Flesh and Blood perfectly. It's incredibly difficult to play a game perfectly, even if it's only 4 or 5 turns long. There's always things you can do better, and there's always things that you can grind out little edges.
So then let's dive a little bit more into those older days where you played Yu-Gi-Oh! You touched on a few things already, especially on the side that you love in Flesh and Blood, but what is it that you miss about those days playing Yu-Gi-Oh?
Yeah, kind of like I said, one of the most fun things in Yu-Gi-Oh! Is how creative and explosive you can be. In Flesh and Blood, there's not really a whole lot that reminds me of Yu-Gi-Oh! They're actually on really opposite ends of the card game spectrum. So, being able to, have these cool combos that you can do and set up these massive boards is really interesting. One thing that I like about Flesh and Blood that actually does connect to Yu-Gi-Oh! Is kind of reading your opponent and playing to what you think they have. One thing that's kind of lost in some other games, like Pokemon or even Magic nowadays, is your opponent has set cards or cards in hand, and you kind of have to play and try to understand what they have. There's some high-level stuff in Flesh and Blood with, presenting, damage on your turn versus blocking with all your cards can make your opponent's hand worse because they want to block with their cards, and things like that are really interesting, as well as just the Arsenal Zone being a kind of fallback to Yu-Gi-Oh! Where you can kind of read what your opponent has and try to understand what that is past just guessing. Like, they've seen one pummel, they have 2 left is interesting and all, but it's been in their arsenal 4 turns and they could have pummeled me 3 times. Like, that's a thing that kind of brings me back to Yu-Gi-Oh! And thinking about playing around things like trap cards or hand traps further in the game. But yeah, I mean, the big explosive stuff really is what I miss about Yu-Gi-Oh! Right? I always played decks that played not a whole lot of non-engine cards, is what they're called in Yu-Gi-Oh! Basically cards that don't stop your opponent, or that stop your opponent. I didn't like playing those. I like just doing my thing, and if they set up a board that told me not to do my thing, I liked figuring out a way to do my thing anyway. I didn't like stopping them from getting there, and you kind of can't do that in Flesh and Blood. Your opponent does their thing, and then you do your thing, and you just hope that your thing is a little better, even when there's interaction.
I think a hero that was a little bit more like what you described in Yu-Gi-Oh! Was Icelander, because she was sending frostbites on your turn, right? But other than that, I think you're totally right. Like, it's that experience we don't really have in Flesh and Blood, but some players also really prefer that to not be scared of an Ash Blossom when throwing off an Art of War.
That'd be pretty silly. I have Channel Leak Expanse some Blood Rush Bellows though, and that feels akin to ashing in Art of War.
Yeah. So you talked a lot already about the problem that you see in Yu-Gi-Oh, but can you boil it down to the core problem that you see for yourself that also other players are experiencing in Yu-Gi-Oh?
Yeah, for me, ultimately, the biggest problem in Yu-Gi-Oh, I don't want to say there's a lot of problems, because that sounds like it's like a flawed thing. Every game has a lot of problems. But I think for me, the biggest issue with Yu-Gi-Oh is a lot of the games feel like they are repetitive. And even with all the cool deck building you can do and interesting sideboard strategies and things like that, ultimately, if you're playing a deck into a matchup, it feels like you're doing the same thing a lot of the time. Especially with I guess you can also boil it further down to the dice roll in Yu-Gi-Oh! I don't think that the dice roll in Yu-Gi-Oh! Is as important as some people think it is. Some people think it's, if you go first, you win. If you go second, you lose. It's obviously not that bad. But a lot of the games when you do go first, in particular, are quite boring. For example, a deck that's been played recently that I played a little bit was Fluunderies. And that's basically a deck where every time you go first, you do the exact same thing. You have different ways to get there, but you have 3 cards that you're putting on the field and a couple cards that you're searching to your hand, and you're doing that every time you go first. And most decks have this kind of boring going first plan. Going second in Yu-Gi-Oh! Is amazing. I love it. I have so much fun when I go second. You get to break boards, you get to disrupt meaningfully. But in Yu-Gi-Oh! When you go first, I think that would be my core problem, is the games feel the same when you go first, basically no matter what the matchup is or whatever you're playing.
All right. If any of the viewers wants to contribute to this, then definitely write it in the comments. But let's continue. And I want to ask you, like, how is it different nowadays than back then, as you were having these goals in Yu-Gi-Oh? How do you see Yu-Gi-Oh now, especially from what happened to you in the pro scene coming to Flesh and Blood?
So, like how has Yu-Gi-Oh changed, or?
So your view on it. I mean, you had these aspirations in Yu-Gi-Oh, right? You wanted to go and be the Dragon Duel champion, go to the World Championship and be with those players who already accomplished that. And then realizing when coming to Flesh and Blood that there is also some other things that needs to be considered when doing this.
Yeah, so Yu-Gi-Oh! is always kind of a nostalgic game for me. Like, I still come back to it now. I still play from time to time. I still have to keep up with it because, again, I work at a card shop, so I have to know what I'm talking about. But the things that have kind of changed and why I play Flesh and Blood now, and why my goals perhaps have changed, are, I think the reason for wanting to do so well in Yu-Gi-Oh! And wanting to be a pro was I wanted to travel with my friends and experience things with other people who enjoyed the games that I was playing. And I wanted to, get recognition as a really good card game player. But I don't think that my goals in Yu-Gi-Oh! Were connected to Yu-Gi-Oh! It was, I wanted to be really, good at card games and travel around and have fun. And then I also enjoyed playing Yu-Gi-Oh! For Flesh and Blood, it's still, I want to travel around and have fun with my friends and, work hard for a tournament and do well and get recognition. But I also like playing Flesh and Blood. So I don't think anything about how I view my goals has changed. Honestly, my goals are largely the same. The only real difference is they're attainable in Flesh and Blood, whereas in Yu-Gi-Oh, I don't think I was quite there. But really, I mean, it's just I enjoy the game more, and so being able to do the goals and achieve them is a lot easier in Flesh and Blood, and in my opinion, a lot more fun.
All right, then let's come to the time that you discovered Flesh and Blood again and talk about Flesh and Blood versus Yu-Gi-Oh in a little bit more detail, because you traveled a lot for Flesh and Blood, and I actually want to give those viewers who are not into Flesh and Blood and are still on, look out for what you actually did.
So this year in Flesh and Blood, so last year in Flesh and Blood, I was more unknown. My main accomplishments were just like top 8ing a Battle Hardened and bubbling out of US Nationals top 8. I got 11th. But this year I really kind of stepped it up and showed my skill. I actually just found out about 20 minutes before we started recording this that I won the like new Fresh Face award for the Instant Speedy Awards. So pretty excited about that. But this year I kind of, I guess, like burst onto the scene. I top 8'd the Calling in Indianapolis in February, and then I top 4'd US Nationals. I top 8'd some Battle Hardens and some PTI events, and then I ended up winning 2 Battle Hardens and a PTI event. I went to my hometown in St. Louis. I drove 20 minutes away from my house, and then I won the Battle Hardened and PTI event in the same weekend, and then I won the Battle Hardened in Barcelona just recently, like we talked about. But this year's been amazing for me. I mean, especially compared to what I could have achieved in Yu-Gi-Oh, like being able to compete at this high level and get, like 5 PTIs and all these, different accolades, and meeting so many new people is a lot easier in this game as well. The people are a lot friendlier in this game than any other game I've played. I've gone to tournaments for a lot of different games, and like the community in this game is so welcoming and warm. And I mean, I think this is a game to play if you're kind of on the fence, if you're still on Team Yu-Gi-Oh. I don't fault you for that. Yu-Gi-Oh is a lot of fun. But if you're a competitive-minded player, or even just a casual player, I think coming over to this game will be a good decision for you, especially if you enjoy playing the game. The competitive scene is great. The people are amazing. The travel opportunities are very good. And there's also good return on investment, not just with traveling to events, but also, like I said earlier, just buying cards is a good investment in this game because the cards hold value and you can build up a collection. But ultimately, I think this game just has a lot more for me. It's a more rewarding experience, so I enjoy it more.
So then let's compare from the pro player Lucas Oswald's perspective. What does Flesh and Blood really do better than Yu-Gi-Oh for you as the pro player? We touched on the monetization a lot already, but what is it else that you feel you are more at home?
So one thing about Flesh and Blood that's different from pretty much every single game is you draw so many cards. There are games where you see a lot of cards, things like Yu-Gi-Oh or Pokemon where you search your deck a lot. You can see cards and you can, get cards that you want. Or a game like Magic where you don't have as much searchability, but the game lasts a long time and you draw 1 card a turn, so you still see a lot of cards. But like in Flesh and Blood, you draw so many cards in so many different sequences that there's so many different possibilities with each hand. Each hand is like a new puzzle to be cracked, and you're trying to figure out the best way to, play it against what your opponent's doing. And you get to do that every single turn. Even in a short game that's like 4 turns long, you still see 16, 17, 18 cards or more if you're playing cards that draw. And every time you draw, you have to readjust your game plan and readjust how you're going to play into a certain matchup. Also, there are skills in Flesh and Blood that I excel at and also enjoy doing that are pretty much just non-existent in other games. Like doing the math on your hand is just not something that you see in any other game, with the possible exception of Magic. But kind of being able to get some hands down to a science and be able to know that you're making the right play is something kind of unique in Flesh and Blood. And then also some other things I like. I love the pitch stacking. I love the fatigue thing. That might be like a hot take. I know a lot of people dislike fatigue in this game, but I think it presents a really interesting challenge and kind of something that's very unique. One of my favorite things to do in this game is play certain decks into fatigue decks and just pitch stack end games. You hear pro players talk about like pitch stacking a lot, and it's not you can't like pitch deck a perfect hand. If you could always pitch Rain Razors and a 3 of a kind and 3 arrows, like everybody would do it. But like presenting the challenge of like dealing with these fatigue decks, especially ones that present disruption, and figuring out, can I pitch a red here to second cycle, or is it too bad this turn? Or, what do I have in my next cycle hand? Do I need a red? Do I need a blue? My opponent's attacking me with Crippling Crush and they're trying to fatigue me. I need to not die. I need to make sure my second cycle is good, and I need to make sure I have enough pressure in first cycle to keep them on the back foot. Like, there's so much interesting that goes on there, and that's why I like Flesh and Blood from a pro player's perspective. And then different from Yu-Gi-Oh, where you see your first 5 cards, and those are the 5 cards you play with. You are playing them against your opponent, and you're constantly getting new information on when they play. But ultimately, you have one hand that you play, and you want to play it a certain way, and you're just trying to figure out how you can play it. And so there's like one hand that you play, whereas in Flesh and Blood you have so many new hands and new decisions to make. Yeah, I think ultimately it's simpler because the turn cycles are smaller, but it's a lot more complex because there's so much that goes on outside of just each hand.
All right, so then let's talk about I want to talk about the parallels that we have in both games, because I think either way, you can find something that you already know and love. But as you said, there are quite some big gaps between the core fundamentals of the game. So is there anything that you have that connects Yu-Gi-Oh! To Flesh and Blood that you really like about it?
Yeah, like I said earlier, the Arsenal Zone is pretty similar to setting cards, especially if it's something like a Sink Below or literally any card in Icelander's Arsenal. But there's a lot of like disruptive effects and setup effects that you can arsenal, similar to in Yu-Gi-Oh, where you might set a card and wait to try to disrupt your opponent where he's on your next turn. So that's an interesting parallel. Also, I think deck building can be pretty close in the games. Other games have it a little different, but Yu-Gi-Oh and Flesh and Blood both have, even though Yu-Gi-Oh has one hand and Flesh and Blood has like 10, you still want every hand to have a certain formula. And Flesh and Blood, for most decks, that's either 1 blue and 3 reds, or 3 blues and 1 red. And then in Yu-Gi-Oh, it's, I want a starter and an extender and, X non-engine cards. But kind of crafting your hands that you want and figuring out, how you're supposed to get there without sacrificing consistency and power is really interesting. That's one of the things that I felt like I've been able to do the best in Flesh and Blood compared to some other really good Flesh and Blood players, is bring aspects of Yu-Gi-Oh deck building over here and try to apply them in a different game. So I think deck building can be pretty similar. And then also there is an element of disruption in Flesh and Blood, especially if you're playing something like Bravo or Icelander or Oldhim. And that's kind of something that can come from Yu-Gi-Oh as well. Playing the decks that I like to play in Yu-Gi-Oh, I always like to break boards and break through my opponent's disruption. And that can be something that, like, playing against a fatigue deck or a super disruptive deck can be, is trying to pick your spots and figure out when you're supposed to push and how you're supposed to set up. Can feel like playing a Yu-Gi-Oh deck into another Yu-Gi-Oh deck. And then on the other side, playing a disruptive deck. Fatigue decks are a little special. There's really nothing like it in Yu-Gi-Oh. There's stun decks, but it's not quite the same. But setting up this different disruption for different matchups is really cool. Playing like Icelander was one of my favorite decks, and into like Bravo, Channel Lake Frigid was worse, but into Azalea, it's like the best card in your deck. And playing a Wounded Bull versus an Aether Ice Vein in some matchups is better, and sometimes it's worse. And kind of adapting to the whole meta and everything that you're going to play against and the different decks that you're going to play against is something that I think really connects the two decks, or the two games, really well. The strength of Command and Conquer in some matchups versus others is akin to the strength of Nibiru in some matchups versus others, something like that.
So when other Yu-Gi-Oh players are watching this and they are thinking about trying out Flesh and Blood, or even because the reasons you already brought up, if they want to become a player in Flesh and Blood, either on the casual or on the pro side, what do you think is their strengths when they come over? You already touched about it, but what is really the core thing about it?
Why
we saw a lot of Magic players, right? They had also strengths they could convert over.
Yeah, so being able to read your opponent is a really, really important part of Yu-Gi-Oh! And not just like a poker read where it's like, his eyes are darting around or whatever, but like being able to make educated guesses on what your opponent has based on what they've done is something that, Yu-Gi-Oh has a lot of, and Flesh and Blood also has a lot of. My opponent's blocked with one card this turn, and I could play this card or arsenal this card. Do they want to block with a card or not? Making those types of decisions can kind of remind me of Yu-Gi-Oh, where my opponents played one hand trap, but they played it on the first thing I did. So maybe they don't have another one because they're trying to, just stop me because their one hand trap does nothing in the middle of my combo or whatever it is. But making a read on what your opponent has based on their actions is something that's really nice to connect the games. And then also, like I said, deck building can be quite similar. Using the hypergeometric calculator, if that's your thing, if you're a math guy, is really useful in both games, especially compared to some other games. And then kind of getting your ratios down and understanding how to use tech cards in the sideboard is really unique in Flesh and Blood. But if it's close to anything, I think it's close to Yu-Gi-Oh, because every slot counts, and you need to be able to draw your sideboard cards, right? This thing of like, I have 2 slots left, let's throw in 2 poppers for Dromai is kind of like a magic thing, but like that's boring, right? That doesn't do a whole lot. But like this Yu-Gi-Oh idea where you have this transformational sideboard when I'm playing Prism and I have Luminaris into a lot of things, but then if I play into Assassin, I might bring in 20 or not 20, like 12 cards for this new Iris plan is kind of like a old Yu-Gi-Oh thing that people used to do, or switching out your tech cards, Brain Freeze for Warmonger's Diplomacy or something like that is a Yu-Gi-Oh feeling concept. So I think like sideboarding, deck building, and reading your opponent are like the biggest things that connect the two games, and that'll give you an advantage if you are a Yu-Gi-Oh player coming to play Flesh and Blood.
One last thing before we jump to the last topic is I want to ask you about those decks in Flesh and Blood that also can present a board and build up over time. We're not doing it in one turn like in Yu-Gi-Oh, but yeah. What do you think about those? Are those interesting for Yu-Gi-Oh players that come in the game?
Yeah, I think some of them can be. I think the way that Flesh and Blood approaches building a board is a lot different than most other games, and specifically a Yu-Gi-Oh. And I think, unfortunately, I don't think that you'll be super interested in these decks because they build boards, because they do it so differently than Yu-Gi-Oh. I think playing something like Pistol Dash or Combo Icelander or Dromai will make you feel less like playing like a combo deck in Yu-Gi-Oh and more like you're playing not like a mid-range deck, like a trap deck that plays and sets up your graveyard almost, and has these resources that you can use over and over again, like your Insidious Chill Triggers or your Plasma Purifiers. So I think that's more like resource management and investment into a card, because in Yu-Gi-Oh, typically cards that are good in the graveyard are weaker when you play them because they have this extra effect. In Flesh and Blood, it's the same. Plasma Purifier is pretty weak when you play it. It does literally nothing, but then over the game, you'll get more returns on it, and it'll be kind of like this recursion package, even if it's not literally recursion. It's this thing that you can use every turn. So I think that while it might be appealing to Yu-Gi-Oh players, I don't think it's something that's super similar between the games because they do it in such different ways.
All right, then let's close out the comparison between Yu-Gi-Oh and Flesh and Blood here. And we will talk about one last topic, but if any of the viewers still wants to contribute to the conversation about Yu-Gi-Oh and Flesh and Blood, leave them in the comments. And now let's talk about Lucas, the Flesh and Blood player, how he is nowadays. Because we talked about the tournaments you played already, but we didn't touch on one really important part about that. And that is the team you are on, the Fabled Runaways.
Yeah, so the Fabled Runaways is the best team in Flesh and Blood. We had 5 out of 8 spots in the U.S. Nationals tournament. We've had a lot of Battle Hardened wins. We've had a lot of major finishes with a variety of different decks, and we expect to get a lot more coming up. One cool thing that we have going on right now is actually our Discord subscription program, where you can sign up. There are different tiers, but at the highest tier, at least, you can actually interact and talk with the members of the team consistently. We have a lot of interaction there, and we don't see it as like a subscription thing or like a job thing. Like, I'm not responding to people in the Majestic chat because I have to. We're not getting paid for it. I'm responding because it's interesting and because we like discussing with people. And so if you would love to join that, I think that's a really good opportunity if you're trying to level up as a player. It also helps us because it gives us access to more people with interesting ideas and thoughts. If you also join the Discord, you can ask questions for our weekly podcast that we will answer, even if we go over our ideal time by a lot. But yeah, I mean, you go in there, you can talk with us and other members of the community, as well as. Are these guys being too loud?
They're having fun. I'm hearing it.
Okay, here. I'll go grab one of them. I'll be right back. Please. Sorry about that.
No problem. There you are.
All right. Anyway, so as I was saying, in the Runaways Discord, you can meet and interact with other people as well as members of the team. But for me, the team has been a huge source of not only inspiration, but also like camaraderie and friendship. Being able to interact with people that I enjoy talking to and collaborate with them on strategies, decks, and deck building has been a really big level up. One tournament that I forgot to mention was Pro Tour Baltimore, where I was 9-1, and then I ended up losing the next 3 rounds to a 10-4 finish. I ended up getting 18th, but that was still a very solid finish, and there's no chance that I could have done that without my team. That was the first event where I was with my team, and then after that, it was every event was constantly. So I would not only recommend that anybody out there look for a team or just other people to play with, but if you can't find that, or if you have found that and you're looking for more, I'd really encourage you to join our Discord, even just the public tier where we, discuss things. We go over spoilers and strategies and things like that. You don't have to pay. Although obviously if you do, you'll get more access to us and more access to giveaways and things like that. But yeah, we'd love your support, and we'd love more people to discuss with, because I just love talking to people in the Discord. I know a lot of the other members of the team do. It's really nice to be able to discuss ideas with other people that are also competitively minded.
Yeah, that is, I think it's really unique in Flesh and Blood, talking about these teams that exist in the pro play scene, like the Fabled Runaways that you're on. Because it's not actually like, of course, everyone is competing with each other, but everyone is also learning with each other. And that is pretty unique, right? The community aspect.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, the whole team system in Flesh and Blood is actually kind of funny, because like everyone's just friends anyway. Like I'm friends with so many people on all the other teams. Like it just kind of creates this like really fun like little rivalry thing where I'll walk up to like Brody and Michael after a tournament, and I'll be like, "Hey guys, we are doing better than you so far. Like there's another win for the Runaways." Or we'll see other teams doing incredibly well, like at Worlds, like Team Blue Pitch, like oh my gosh, like that was like insane finish for that team. And then it's really interesting to see like every big event it like shifts. Like Pro Tour Baltimore was like Wolfpack's tournament, and then like Nationals was just like Runaways tournament, like actually insane, like 5 out of 8 in the top 8 with 4 different decks is ridiculous. We see Blue Pitch doing so well at Worlds. We see Stroopwaffle doing really well recently. The card guys, the bane of my existence, they get a shout out too. But there's so many good teams, and there's so much camaraderie and rivalry between the teams. It's a lot of fun compared to other games like Yu-Gi-Oh or Magic, where it might be a little more like serious and like really trying to get edges or whatever. But we're just here to have fun and play good games and hopefully beat everybody else.
So then let's come to an important question. I think that, of course, you have set your side, the game that you love the most, but if in the world Yu-Gi-Oh would change up, which I think we both know it would not happen, but what would need to change? Like,
for me to come back?
Yes.
So the thing about Yu-Gi-Oh is I don't really have any huge problems with the game, like playing it. I still enjoy playing it. I think it's interesting. I really like smaller metagames, and they've had a lot of really wide open metagames recently, which I'm not a huge fan of, but I could take that or leave that from a casual perspective. From a competitive perspective, I don't think it really makes sense for me to play Yu-Gi-Oh unless the prizing gets better or if there's more access to big events. Because ultimately, it's like, I like Flesh and Blood more, but even if I like Yu-Gi-Oh a little more, it just makes so much more sense for me to play Flesh and Blood with the prizing, with the investment, like I've said. And then also, like, some of my best friends play Flesh and Blood, and I think that the community is better and more fun to talk to. Not throwing any shade at the Yu-Gi-Oh community. I love a lot of those guys. Yeah. But I think it would take a lot of revamping, because right now it's just everything's coming up Flesh and Blood for me right now. I just have no real reason to play Yu-Gi-Oh unless it just changed to become Flesh and Blood with different rules.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah, I think it's with a player like yourself that has these dreams and these goals of competing at the highest level, traveling the world, doing all these crazy things. The environment in Yu-Gi-Oh is just so different compared to Flesh and Blood. We talked in a lot of detail about it in this video. But I think something to say at the end is also really interesting, because when comparing the Flesh and Blood and the Yu-Gi-Oh! World Championship, it can be a totally different thing, right? Even though it is so hard to get to the World Championship in Yu-Gi-Oh!
Yeah, they're just not. Yeah, they're just not even close to the same. It makes it really interesting to like compete, because for Yu-Gi-Oh, it's, if you're unfamiliar with the World Championship for either game, the Yu-Gi-Oh World Championship, the main event is 24 players. The Dragon Duel event is 12 players, and then there's a Master Duel and a Speed or Duel Links Championships as well that I think are also around 12 players. Not 100% sure for that though. But like, it's also the format that the TCGs play is not a real format. They merged the two ban lists for the OCG, which is over in Asia, and the TCG, which is in the Americas and South America and Europe and Oceania. And so the format is actually just not something you play anywhere else. Whereas in Flesh and Blood, it's like a 400 player tournament that's much easier to qualify for, and is a very real format that you have to play, and that's been evolving and will continue to evolve. So Flesh and Blood Worlds really feels like another major, like another just huge tournament. Even if it's smaller than something like a Pro Tour, it's still this big event with huge stakes. Whereas Yu-Gi-Oh! Worlds honestly feels like it's like a big locals. It's not even a big locals, it's a small locals. It's like a small locals where everybody is one of the best players in the world, and you're playing this format that nobody will ever play, and just seeing what you can do. But I think for Yu-Gi-Oh, it's a lot of like the experience. Not to take away from anybody who's done well at Worlds. It's an incredibly difficult tournament, but it's a lot fewer rounds. It's a lot different to prepare for, and you don't have as many great players, even if everyone's a good player. There's not a whole lot of innovation. Some years there's crazy innovation, but it's just a different beast, really.
I think the World Championship discussion is also interesting in these particular games, because in Flesh and Blood it is possible to play in the World Championship even though you didn't qualify for it yourself, right? In Yu-Gi-Oh, that isn't possible at all.
Yeah, being able to buy your invite with the PTA system is really interesting. I will say, I think most people who do buy their invites are... I don't really know how to phrase this well. I usually don't look down on someone because they bought an invite. I think a lot of being able to qualify for these tournaments is region-based. Some regions just have fewer players, or everybody there is a newer player. And then some regions are really hard to qualify for. Like qualifying... This, you especially see this at Pro Tours, but like, some players from the US that don't qualify and have to buy a PTI are kind of silly. Like the skill level of some of the players that I've seen buy PTIs for these events is really, really high, and is a lot higher than the skill level of some people that I see even from the same region. So I think like being able to buy your PTI, while it's strange, I think for the most part it's not abused, and it doesn't, like the worst fear, the worst case scenario would be like a bunch of players that, probably don't, not very nice things to say, but probably don't deserve to play at such a high level because, they don't put the time in. But those players usually aren't there, right? The people who buy their PTIs usually, at least in my opinion, deserve to be able to play there even if they didn't earn it through the means they're supposed to, I guess.
Is that something that you would like to narrow down more in the future in Flesh and Blood compared to Yu-Gi-Oh? Because it is so exclusive to come to the Yu-Gi-Oh! World Championship. And in Flesh and Blood, it's also a very big privilege to play in the World Championship, but it is kind of different.
Yeah, I would never want it to be as small as Yu-Gi-Oh! I would never want like a fewer than 100 players, I think. But a smaller event that's like 200 to 300 players, I could see that being interesting. Just really like the cream of the crop. One thing that was a little awkward with this year's Worlds was there was probably probably not enough rounds to kind of get the number that they wanted. Like the bubbling was a little awkward, and so that's something they could solve by changing the number of rounds or the number of players invited, which they are doing. Obviously, fewer players invited to the next Pro Tour means almost certainly fewer players invited to the next World Championship. So I'm excited for smaller Worlds, smaller Pro Tours. I think it increases the average player level by a lot, which is something that I'm really into. I think like the hardest events that I've played in are the ones I do the best. Like the number of like named players that I played against is like directly correlated to how well I do. Like at Battle Hardened in Barcelona, it was like Pablo Pintor, Charles Dunn, like just a bunch of other like insane players that I played against, and I did well there. Like US Nationals, every single round with like 3 or 4 exceptions, I knew who I was playing against and I was scared of them. So I'm really excited for the competition level to increase in Worlds in the future, but I don't think it's a huge deal either way for me. Bring them on, whoever they are.
So then at the end here, is there a bonus tip that you can give to the viewers? Maybe players that are in Yu-Gi-Oh! At the moment and they think about transitioning to Flesh and Blood or giving it a try.
Yeah, I mean, this might be a little bit of a silly tip, but check out YouTube channels and podcasts. I think that's the most unique thing that Flesh and Blood has over other games that can help you level up, is going to things like your channel or the Runaways channel, or historically Arsenal Pass or the Manor Cast, things like that. This game has really good resources to help you level up. It has really good basics. It has really good mid-level player, helping you get from the basic to the competitive. And then once you're at the competitive and pro level, there's even more content to consume. Like I said already, obviously the Runaways I think is probably the premier spot for that, especially with our podcast coming out. But there are a lot of great podcasts and channels for each level. The Card Guys, like I mentioned already, is another good example. But really, for every step of the way, there are people out there who are willing to help you, not just with their YouTube channels, but also, with the community interaction and entering these different Discords, like the Runaways Discord, the Card Guys Discord, the Purple Discord, things like that. There's always people out there who are trying to get better and are at your level, and using the resources properly is something that I think you could do in this game better than any other game. Because really, Magic, Pokemon, Yu-Gi-Oh, they don't have access to these resources, right? They don't have Fabrary, which is one of the most ridiculously useful sites in any card game. I think it's the best card game site that's ever existed. There's so much you can do, and I think if you want to level up in Flesh and Blood, you can, and you just got to put the work in and understand how to do it and listen to the right people.
All right, that's a really good tip to give you at the end. If still any questions are open, like I said, drop them in the comments. Definitely hit the like button for Lucas dropping so many thoughts about Yu-Gi-Oh! And Flesh and Blood today. And check out the Fabled Runaways, like Chris already said. So we will close out this season now. Lucas, thank you so much for being on my channel, talking about Yu-Gi-Oh! And Flesh and Blood.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. I had a lot of fun.